Christopher Plummer finally confirms what happened on Sound of Music set in a series of revelations that contrast sharply with the film's public success. We all know it as the wholesome classic that defined an era, right? But the story off camera was nothing like the fairy tale we saw on screen. Christopher Plummer just broke his silence, finally revealing shocking truths that flipped everything we thought we knew about the film, from chaotic shoot days to hidden feuds and secrets that nearly derailed production. Stick around, because this is not The Sound of Music. You remember Plummer's reluctant start with The Sound of Music. Christopher Plummer never made any effort to hide how much he disliked The Sound of Music in the beginning. While millions of people adored the movie and saw it as one of the most heartwarming films ever made, he viewed it quite differently. To him, it was not a masterpiece, but a sentimental and overly sweet musical that didn't challenge his talent as an actor. Those who knew him back then often said he carried himself like a man who had been dragged into something he wanted no part of. When the script first landed on his desk, he had almost thrown it aside. He was, after all, a classically trained Shakespearean actor who had built his reputation on complex layered characters, not singing fathers leading a group of children through the Austrian hills. He thought taking such a role might make the world forget his serious side as an artist. And honestly, who could blame him for worrying that playing Captain Von Trapp might label him as a light-hearted musical actor rather than profound performer he believed himself to be? The role itself didn't help his case. Captain Von Trapp was, in Plummer's eyes, a rather dull and predictable man, strict, proud, and softened only by the magic of love and song. There wasn't much depth there, he thought. No room to stretch or explore. Plummer wanted roles that tested his craft, that forced him to dig deep and feel something raw. But this was a story drenched in charm, melody, and sentiment. And to make matters worse, he thought he was far too young to play the father of 7 children. He was just 36 at the time, still energetic and sharp-faced, not exactly the picture of a widowed patriarch with a 16-year-old daughter. He reportedly joked that he could barely picture himself as the father of 1 child, let alone a family choir. Plummer's dislike of musicals went beyond this particular project. He simply never found the genre appealing. To him, musicals lacked the seriousness he associated with good drama. He would often mock the film's tone, calling it the sound of mucus whenever he got the chance. People laughed, but they could tell he meant it. He thought the story was so sweet that it could almost make your teeth ache. He even once said that working on the film was like being hit over the head with a giant Valentine's Day card every single day. It wasn't that he despised Japier or optimism. He just didn't believe in stories that painted life with such a rosy brush. Could anyone blame him for wanting something with a bit more bite, more realism, more truth? Still, even with all his complaints, Plummer couldn't just walk away. He had already signed the contract, and that signature tied him down tightly. When another opportunity came up, a more serious theatrical role that appealed to the actor in him, he tried to pull out of The Sound of Music. But by then, the studio had spent too much money and time preparing for the shoot. They weren't about to let him go that easily. The studio's lawyers made it clear that if he backed out, there would be serious consequences. It could have destroyed his career before it even truly began. So, faced with the unpleasant choice between artistic pride and professional survival, Plummer decided to stay. It wasn't exactly a choice made with joy, but with resignation. Sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of saying no. Ironically, that reluctant yes would turn out to be the very thing that made him a household name. Millions would come to love his performance, his charm, and his stern but gentle portrayal of Captain Von Trapp. Yet, even as the film broke records and became one of the most beloved musicals in history, Plummer himself never truly warmed up to it. He later admitted he respected the film for what it meant to audiences, but he never found much joy in his own part. During the filming, his frustration only deepened. The cheerful songs, the endless rehearsals, the sugary tone, all of it grated on his nerves. There was a kind of irony in watching a man so deeply skeptical of the story help bring it to life so beautifully. Did he ever wonder years later how something he once despised became a classic that people still cherish? Behind the smiles and the songs, there was a very different atmosphere for him. The production, though iconic on screen, wasn't the dream experience many imagined. He sometimes complained about the long shoots, the sentimental script, and even the constant presence of the children. It wasn't that he disliked them personally. Julie Andrews, for instance, he admired greatly, but he often described the experience as painfully wholesome, something that tested his patience as much as his acting skills. And yet, through all of that frustration, he managed to deliver a performance that has stood the test of time. A performance so raw, so unfiltered that even decades later, people still talk about it. But what most fans never saw was the storm raging behind the scenes, the tension, the tempers, and the chaos that nearly tore the entire set apart. The truth behind this movie is even wilder than the story on screen. Stay with me till the very end. It only gets more unbelievable from here. Behind the scenes chaos, drinking, and disasters. Behind the beautiful magic of the Sound of Music, beneath its glossy scenes and cheerful songs, there was a much different story unfolding. One filled with mishaps, frustrations, and moments that were far from picture perfect. It was said that what looked like a dream on screen was in reality a series of exhausting, chaotic, and sometimes painful experiences for those who brought it to life. Who would have thought that such a beloved family classic, one that seemed so full of joy and harmony, had such a difficult journey behind the scenes? Julie Andrews, for instance, had one of the toughest tasks right at the very beginning of the film. That iconic moment when Maria twirls around the open Austrian hillside, her arms wide and her voice echoing through the valley, looked effortless to audiences. But Andrews later admitted it was nothing close to the peaceful picture people saw. She described how a cameraman strapped to a helicopter had to fly in close to capture the sweeping aerial shots. The problem, she explained, was that every time the helicopter circled around her, the force from its downdraft sent her tumbling straight into the grass. She would start gracefully, twirling with that joyful smile, and then wham, she'd be knocked flat on her back by the wind. Andrews said it happened over and over again. After 6 or 7 takes, she was left spitting dirt and hay, frustrated and sore. She kept smiling for the camera, of course. But deep down, she was fuming at how difficult it all was. Could anyone blame her? After all, how could something so simple on screen feel like a battlefield behind the lens? Then there was Christopher Plummer, who played the stern yet charming Captain Von Trapp. Despite the praise he received for his performance, he was anything but happy during filming. Many years later, he confessed that he had been drinking heavily throughout production. In fact, he openly admitted that he was dead drunk during one of the film's most emotional moments, the music festival scene where he performs Adolf Weiss. Looking back, Plummer didn't sugarcoat his behavior. He described himself as a pampered and arrogant young man. Spoiled by success on the stage, his dissatisfaction with the project even extended to his appearance. He indulged so much in Austrian food and wine that his costumes kept getting tighter by the day. Taylor had to let them out to their very limits, and in some cases remake them completely. It seemed that the more Plummer tried to drown his boredom and frustration, the more production had to work around his excesses. Isn't it ironic that one of the most elegant characters in the film was often in reality just trying to hold himself together off camera? Not all challenges were the result of tempers or frustration, though sometimes even the most romantic scenes turned into unintentional comedies. Take the beloved gazebo scene, for example. The tender moment when Maria and Captain Von Trapp finally admit their feelings for each other. It looked like pure movie magic, but Andrews and Plummer couldn't stop laughing long enough to get through it properly. The problem wasn't them exactly. It was the lighting equipment. Every time they leaned in for a kiss, the machinery would make a loud raspberry-like noise, completely ruining the moment. Imagine trying to stay serious when all you can hear is that sound. The director, Robert Weiss, grew increasingly frustrated after more than 20 takes. And in the end, he gave up on his original plan. He decided to film the scene in silhouette, not for artistic effect, but to hide the fact that both actors were struggling to keep straight faces. It was one of those times when technical difficulties became a blessing in disguise, though no one on set found it particularly funny at the time. Yet, not all mishaps were harmless. Some were genuinely frightening. One of the most alarming incidents happened during the rowboat scene. The moment looked innocent enough. The children and Maria singing joyfully on a boat before it tips over into the water. But what most people didn't know was that Kim Karth, who played Little Gretel, couldn't swim. Andrews was told before shooting that if the boat capsized, she should reach for Kim immediately. But when the cameras rolled, chaos struck. The boat flipped the wrong way and Andrews fell in the opposite direction. Kim went under not once, but twice before crew members managed to pull her out. The experience was terrifying for the young girl, and she later revealed that it left her with a lasting fear of swimming. One couldn't help but wonder how could something meant to look so playful nearly end in tragedy. And then there was Charmian Carr, the actress who played Liesl, who also had her fair share of pain on set. While filming the lively 16 going on 17 sequence, she had to dance around the gazebo benches. The floor was wet, and she wasn't wearing proper shoes. In one unfortunate slip, she crashed right through a glass pane and injured herself badly. Still, she finished the scene, hiding her pain behind a smile, proving that even the light-hearted moment of the film demanded an incredible amount of endurance and professionalism. Looking back, it seemed as though The Sound of Music was never just another movie. It was a test of spirit. Behind those sweeping hills and joyful songs were long days, unexpected tensions, and quiet moments that only those on set truly understood. It wasn't merely about acting. It demanded courage to face frustration, patience to endure perfectionism, and humor to survive it all. And while the world only saw the smiles, there were truths buried deep beneath the melodies. Truths that one man, Christopher Plummer himself, would later reveal. Stay with me till the very end. It's eye-opening. The hidden truths. Plummer finally confirmed. Decades after The Sound of Music first swept the world off its feet, Christopher Plummer finally began to speak more openly about his experience with the film. And what he revealed left many longtime fans both surprised and intrigued. After all, how could someone who played such an iconic role, one that had become a cherished part of movie history, have carried so many private feelings and hidden truths about it? For years, audiences had adored Captain Von Trapp, the strict but secretly tender father who eventually softens under the charm of Maria and the healing power of music. But behind the camera, Plummer's feelings about the role were far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. He admitted that even though people often praise a performance, not everything that audiences heard in the film actually came from his own voice. While he did have a decent singing voice, the producers thought it wasn't quite up to the professional standard they wanted for such a big production. They felt it needed a smoother, more polished quality, something that would perfectly match the film's emotional tone. As a result, they decided to have a professional playback singer, Bill Lee, record all of Captain Von Trapp's songs, including the heartfelt performance of Edelweiss. Plummer later shared that he wasn't offended by this decision, though he did find it a bit amusing that someone else was literally singing for him while he was lip-syncing with such deep emotion. He mentioned that Bill Lee's voice actually sounded very close to his own, which made the final product believable. Still, one can't help but wonder how Plummer must have felt knowing that a moment so loved by millions didn't quite belong entirely to him. Years later, fans were thrilled when a special 4-disc collector's edition of The Sound of Music finally included Plummer's original recordings, his real unedited vocals. Listeners described his voice as less refined, but incredibly sincere, filled with emotion and rawness that somehow made the songs even more touching. There was something deeply human about hearing those versions, as if a piece of truth had finally been restored as a story that everyone thought they already knew by heart. It made people reflect on how sometimes imperfection can hold more beauty than perfection ever could. But perhaps the most shocking confession Plummer ever made about filming the movie was that he had actually been drunk during one of its most iconic scenes. He revealed that when they shot the music festival sequence, the moment when Captain Von Trapp sings Edelweiss in front of an entire crowd, he had been completely intoxicated. He said he was trembling with fear, overwhelmed by the pressure of performing with a full orchestra watching him. It wasn't just stage fright. It was something deeper, a kind of emotional vulnerability he couldn't quite control. According to Plummer, Julie Andrews had to physically steady him because he was shaking so much, and without her support, he might have fainted right there on set. He later admitted with a mix of humor and honesty that his heavy drinking throughout the filming wasn't just about nerves. It was also because he fell out of place in the movie itself. The Sound of Music was full of optimism, sweetness, and sentimentality. And while the world loved that, Plummer himself struggled with it. He thought the material was too saccharine, Too goody-goody, as he once described it, and it made him uncomfortable. He was a classically trained actor who preferred darker, more complex roles. And suddenly he found himself in a story about nuns, children, and sing-alongs. How could someone like him possibly fit into a world like that? It seemed almost ironic that the same film he once resisted became the very project that would define his legacy. In the years that followed, Plummer often reflected on how his feelings toward the sound of music evolved. At first, he had distanced himself from it, calling it the sound of mucus as a playful jab. But as time passed and generations grew up loving the movie, he began to soften. He saw how deeply it touched people, how its message of love, courage, and family had endured across decades. It was as if he finally understood that while he might have wrestled with his own discomfort and insecurities during production, the film itself had taken on a life far bigger than any one person's opinion of it. So when he looked back and spoke about those early years, his tone was different, gentler, even nostalgic. He no longer mocked it, but instead spoke about it with a kind of fond acceptance, as though he finally made peace with a story that once frustrated him. And maybe that's what made his revelations so fascinating. They weren't just behind-the-scenes secrets, but glimpses into the very human struggle between pride, vulnerability, and the search for authenticity. After all, is it ironic that one of cinema's most enduring moments, a man singing about love for his homeland with tears in his eyes, was performed by someone who, at that very moment, was battling his own fears and doubts inside? It's this contrast between what audiences saw on screen and what really happened behind it that makes Christopher Plummer's confession so compelling. They remind people that even the most beautiful art can be born out of discomfort, that sometimes what feels awkward or imperfect in the moment ends up becoming timeless. And perhaps that's the lasting magic of the sound of music. It wasn't just a perfect fairy tale. It was a mirror of real imperfect humanity. But behind those rolling hills and timeless songs, not everyone saw the magic the same way. In fact, the man who played Captain Von Trapp had a very different opinion. What he said about the film might surprise you. And honestly, it changed the way many fans saw him forever. So, before you hum along to Do Me Again, keep watching till the very end, because his brutally honest confession will leave you speechless. He called it the sound of mucus. Christopher Plummer never made a secret of how he felt about the sound of music. Beyond simply disliking the film, he went a step further. He openly mocked it. People often remembered how he jokingly called it the sound of mucus, a nickname that stuck in pop culture as one of the most brutal but oddly funny criticisms ever made by an actor about his own work. In his 2008 autobiography, In Spite of Myself, he even went out of his way not to mention the movie by its title, referring to it with sly nicknames like S&M or just the movie. It was almost as if he couldn't bring himself to say its name, as though doing so would somehow tie him forever to the sugary sweetness he so despised. And really, could anyone blame him for feeling that way when he was known for playing darker, more complex roles? For an actor like Plummer, who had built his career on intensity and sophistication, a sentimental musical filled with cheerful songs and wide-eyed optimism might have felt like a professional nightmare. He often said that the romance between Captain Von Trapp and Maria felt forced, too polished, and completely unrealistic. To him, it was an overblown fairy tale disguised as a love story, the kind that made his skin crawl. He once said that working with Julie Andrews was like being repeatedly hit over the head with Valentine, a comment that sounded both humorous and exasperated at the same time. It wasn't that he disliked Andrews personally. He actually admired her talent and charm, but he couldn't quite stomach the overly romantic tone the film demanded from him. One might wonder, though, how strange it must have felt to play such a beloved character while secretly rolling his eyes inside. Did he ever think about how millions of people around the world adored what he dismissed as shallow? Plummer often described the sound of music as awful and sentimental and gooey, a combination of words that painted a clear picture of how much he loathed its syrupy sweetness. To him, it wasn't just a movie. It was a test of patience, a role that trapped him in a world of smiles and songs that never seemed to end. Yet, in an odd twist of fate, the film became one of the biggest successes of his entire career. How ironic is that? The one movie he couldn't stand turned out to be the one that defined him for generations. Everywhere he went, People associate him with Captain Von Trapp, the stern father who learns to love again, and not with his many Shakespearean roles that he considered far more worthy. Over time, he grew to accept that the film's appeal wasn't going away. Fans would still approach him with excitement, their eyes lighting up as they mentioned the movie that had shaped their childhoods. He knew that The Sound of Music meant a lot to people, even if it never meant much to him. Maybe that's the funny thing about art. It doesn't always belong to the artist once it's out in the world. Could it be that Plummer's distaste for the movie made it even more iconic, simply because his honesty added another layer to its story? Perhaps deep down he understood that despite all his mocking, The Sound of Music had a kind of magic he couldn't erase. Still, he never stopped being candid about his feelings. He would laugh at interviews, shaking his head at the mention of the film, as if remembering an embarrassing old love letter he once wrote, but could never take back. For him, The Sound of Music was an experience that was both a blessing and a curse. Beautifully filmed, yes, but unbearably sentimental in a way that went against his artistic instincts. He wasn't the type to enjoy sugar-coated tales, and this one, in his eyes, was coated in sugar from start to finish. From hate to acceptance, a shift in perspective. Over the years, Christopher Plummer's relationship with The Sound of Music took a truly surprising turn, one that no one, not even the man himself, could have predicted. For so long, he had viewed the film as something he simply endured rather than embraced, something he tolerated because of its immense success rather than loved for its sentimental charm. Yet, as time moved on, that resentment slowly softened, shifting into something far more complicated and meaningful. It was almost poetic, really, how a movie he once dismissed as overly sweet and sentimental became one of the work's most closely tied to his legacy. Who could have imagined that the same man who used to roll his eyes at the film's cheerfulness would one day speak of it with genuine warmth? Those who knew Plummer well often pointed out that his friendship with Julie Andrews was one of the brightest and most enduring outcomes of that experience. Though he never hid his feelings about finding the film saccharine, there was something about his connection with Andrews that transcended his cynicism. The two developed a friendship that lasted until the very end of his life. Julie Andrews once mentioned that they had become great friends and that their closeness never really faded. She said they often saw each other, kept in touch, and shared an easy kind of companionship that felt both professional and deeply personal. Plummer himself spoke fondly of their shared experiences, especially recalling moments from their Royal Christmas tour together. Andrews would laugh about how their tour bus had become a little haven of comfort and joy, and Plummer would chime in with that mischievous humor of his, saying they had their own bar on the bus and could hardly wait to get there. Wasn't it strange? One might wonder how two people with such different temperaments, one so optimistic, the other so skeptical, could form such a strong, enduring bond. As Plummer aged, his perspective on The Sound of Music began to mellow. In his 80s, he started to speak of it with a tenderness that surprised many who had heard his earlier criticisms. He admitted that he had come to respect the movie for what it was, a comforting escape from the chaos of modern films filled with gunfire and car chases. He described it as wonderfully old-fashioned and universal, words that carried a sense of reluctant admiration. It was as if he had finally made peace with the film's purity and nostalgia, perhaps realizing that its simplicity was exactly what made it timeless. When he attended the 50th anniversary celebration in 2015, something he had long avoided, he did so with a different spirit. For the first time, he publicly acknowledged The Sound of Music as a cultural touchstone, something that had given joy to millions across generations. And maybe, just maybe, he began to understand why people cherished it so deeply. After all, wasn't there something beautiful about a story that continued to bring families together half a century later? But the true turning point in his heart came during a moment that seemed almost trivial, a children's Easter party. He hadn't planned to watch the film. In fact, he had tried to avoid it. Yet there he was, surrounded by children with the movie playing in the background, and there was no escaping it this time. He eventually gave in, and sat through it, probably with that familiar air of reluctance he carried toward such things. But as the scenes unfolded, the sweeping hills, the songs, the laughter, something shifted. He found himself getting drawn in against his will. In his memoir, He admitted that the more he watched, the more he realized what a terrific movie it truly was. He described it as the very best of its kind. Warm, touching, and timeless. For a man who had prided himself on his sharp, sometimes cynical view of art, this revelation was almost humorous. He even wrote that he was stunned to find himself completely seduced by the very film he had mocked for decades. He called himself a cynical old sod who suddenly felt a rush of pride for having been part of something so enduring. Isn't it fascinating how time, and perhaps a little nostalgia, can soften even the harshest opinions? In that moment, it seemed as if Christopher Plummer had finally allowed himself to see the sound of music the way the rest of the world did, not as a piece of sugary escapism, but as a work of genuine heart and craftsmanship. He realized it wasn't just about singing nuns or cheerful children. It was about love, resilience, and the kind of hope that refuses to die even in dark times. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your